tutorials. In this session we're going to be looking at warp volumes. So in this session we're going to be having a quick look at what are warp volumes and what they can be used for. Then we're going to look at an example of how to do so. Let's jump in. So first we have an example here of 3 warp zones. Basically we're going to walk here in order to warp here. So the first one has no box collider. This one does, just to show you the example of that. And this one as well. But the warp over here, for example, will be using where does a warp point go to? And does it choose the rotation of that object or not? So we'll be using these 3 examples to show what happens when you use a warp volume. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So each one, so this one once again has no collider in there. This one does, as does this one. This is important because if the target you're going to has a collider, you will be pushed out of it. So just make sure that the place you are warping to doesn't have a collider unless that's the effect you want. So we've got that. So, for example, if I walk on this cube here, I will teleport or warp to the first one. Now notice there is a small half drop. That's because the pivot location of that object is where your feet turn up. So that's why there is a small drop in that one. The second one will send us to the top because it will push us above the box collider. Notice how I am facing the same direction as when I entered the collider on the warp volume. And the last example has the warp volume with use rotation. And notice how I have turned around. So I will need to use the mouse to go on the other side, but you can face the direction that the warp target has if you want. So now that we know what the warp volume does, let's look at setting one up. So first off, let's create a 4th warp. So I'm going to create an empty, and let's call this warp 4. Now, the magic happens, actually let's put this over there for now. Let's add a warp volume. So we've got a mono warp, type in warp and just go mono warp script. You'll have this. Now let's warp to one of the other assets. So let's say I want to go to the first cube, which is this one with no box collider. So I'm going to use that. So I'm just going to drag that into the warp point. So that is the target destination. Let's use the rotation this time. So that we can look in the direction that that object is facing. If you want to see where your object is, make sure that this is on pivot or local. And the blue direction is the asset's direction. So when I appear, I will be facing that blue arrow direction. Now, after that, we need to add a collider. Box colliders are recommended, but other colliders work, for example, mesh, sphere, or capsule. Adjust as you need to. So I'm going to put that to the floor, like so. Maybe a bit higher. Now, because it's completely invisible, I'm also going to add a cube. Now, because this is on the parent location, 0, 0, 0, I can just move that down like I have with these ones, and that will show me where the object will be. So if I move the object forward a bit, we have our asset. Now, the other thing to note is your box collider needs to be an is trigger. This is very important. If your box collider is not a trigger, the character will not be able to walk into it, and therefore will not be able to trigger the warp. So make sure that is set to true. Okay, so let's double check. We have our warp 4 with the script, cube 1, which is over here, facing that direction. Use rotation is on, the box collider is there, so as soon as I touch this collider, the player will teleport or warp, and the cube is purely there for visual representation of the location we're going to do. Let's give this one a shot. Okay, so we're going to go over there, facing the right direction. So let's jump in. And notice how I am facing the same direction as the asset that I'm looking at. So yeah. So that is warp volumes. I'm assuming that I'll see a lot of interesting uses for it. See how creative you can get, and happy building.